Quick reminder that our exam is Wednesday. This is the exam for the divided kingdom period, basically, up through the end of First and Second Kings and the prophets of the Southern Kingdom. So the lecture last Monday, I believe, was our last lecture of that set that covered. I'm blanking now. Habakkuk and Zephaniah and Micah and Joel, I think it was. Everything up through that lecture, everything that's about the northern and the southern kingdom, from Solomon through the northern and southern kingdom, and the prophets of the northern and southern kingdom. So that exam will be Wednesday. I won't be here. Somebody else will be giving you the exam and in here while you take it. But you'll have the exam on Wednesday, and then I'll be back on Friday. Today we're looking at Ezekiel. We looked at Daniel on Wednesday of last week, and then I had put Ezekiel on the board hoping we would get there, and then we didn't. But Ezekiel and Daniel have a few things in common. They are both apocalyptic literature, meaning that they see these visions that are extremely strange, and they see these very odd images when they see these visions. And also, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the other young men in Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are all exiles. They're all people that have been carried off from Jerusalem or from Judah during the first major wave of Babylonian deportation. After some period of scuffle and conflict between Judah and Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar came and attacked the city, attacked Jerusalem, and defeated Jerusalem and carried the king, Jehoiakim, off into captivity, and he carried off a huge wave of deportees. And then he appointed someone from the royal line that was willing to be subject to Babylon, named Zedekiah. And he appointed Zedekiah to be king, or to be governor, and then went back to Babylon with all of his captives. And then later, Zedekiah rebels against Babylon, refuses to do the things that he agreed to do when he was made governor, and so Babylon comes back and crushes the city and destroys it. And so there's a first wave where Jerusalem is spared and a lot of captives are taken off, and then later there's another wave where Jerusalem is destroyed after the battle, or by the warfare there, by the siege, and then most of the remaining people are carried off into captivity. And so that's the breakdown, right? And Ezekiel, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a bunch of others are in that first wave of deportation, the first captives that are carried off. And Ezekiel specifically, we're told that he is the first thing that we see for Ezekiel when he is given his first vision. We're told that it's the 5th year of the exile after Jehoiakim has been carried off as a captive. And so Ezekiel and all of those with him are in exile. They've been in exile for 5 years. And we're also told that it is the 30th year of Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel is 30 years old. In fact, I've seen some suggestion that this was possibly his 30th birthday, his first vision. And what's significant about the 30th year for Ezekiel is in the line of the priests, and he had been in training to become a priest. And at 30 years old, a priest is old enough to actually be installed as a priest and begin to function. Until that point, they're in training and they assist the priests and do other things, but they don't actually begin their ministry as priests. They don't start functioning as priests until they're 30 years old. And so this is the point where Ezekiel would have fully become a priest had he not been carried off into exile with most of the others. And so he was carried off into exile when he was about 25 years old, and for 5 years he's been in exile. And then one day during his 30th year, possibly his 30th birthday, he is sitting next to the Kebar River, and he gets this vision. And the Kebar River is in Babylon. It was a river that had been kind of worked and modified to be kind of an irrigation channel or an irrigation source. And so it was used to irrigate all of this farmland. And he is sitting next to this this river with a whole bunch of other captives, a whole bunch of these exiles from Judah, and he sees this vision, and it's weird. He sees these 4 living creatures, and these 4 living creatures have a really weird appearance. We're told that they have 4 faces, and one face looks like a human face, and then one face to the side of that human face looks like an ox, and the face to the other side of that human face looks like a lion, and then the 4th face is like the face of an eagle. And so we've got a man, lion, ox, eagle appearance, depending on which side of the animal or creature you're looking at. And then its body is roughly human, but is glowing like hot metal, and it has wings that are pointed in strange directions. And we're told that each of these creatures, there are 4 of them, and so each of the creatures touch 2 other creatures' wings with their outstretched wings. And so their wings are stretched outward and upward, and the wings touch 2 other of these 4 creatures. And now if you think about the way that looks, then you can't just have them all in a straight line, because then the 2 on the end wouldn't be touching anything on the outside, right? And so they have to be folded together, so the 2 on the end are actually not on the end, but they're touching each other, which means that these 4 are in a kind of square or rectangular shape. So they're 4 creatures, and their wings are touching each other, and they're forming this kind of square shape. And 4 weird faces, and they glow strangely, and they also there's something weird about the way they move. When they move, they don't turn to go in a new direction. They just go there. They don't change their orientation. They just go straight ahead, and they go where they go. And then there are these wheels that are next to the creatures, and the wheels are connected to the creatures, but they're not actually like attached to the creatures. So that when the spirit of the creatures is in the wheel, and so the creature, when the creature moves up, the wheel comes up with it. When the creature moves, the wheel turns and goes with them. But when the creature stands still, the wheel stops and stands still as well. And so the wheels go wherever the creature goes, but it's not directly attached to the creature for each of them. And then above their 4 these interconnected wings, or the wings that are touching each other, the outstretched wings of these 4 creatures, above that there is this vault, or this expanse. This something is up there, kind of like a platform, but not really like a platform. If you look at the word vault is used to describe sky in Genesis, and so this could be this just expanse or something. There's something up there above these 4 wings. And in the midst of that something that's up there, there is a throne, and then seated on that throne is a figure that looks like a man, looks like a human being, and from the waist up, it looks like, it glows like metal that's just been pulled out of a furnace. It glows like extremely hot metal. And then from below the waist, it looks like a raging fire. So instead of the hot metal from the waist up, it's like a flame, a fire from the waist down. And there is this brilliant light that surrounds it, and the light is described as being like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. So the radiance is around him. Now, this is a really weird picture, right? We can all agree that this is a strange image. And it's all extremely tentative. I mean, Ezekiel uses language, he says, it looked like. The 4 living creatures had faces that looked like humans, and lions, and an ox, and an eagle. And the wheels appeared to be doing this and that. And there was the appearance of lightning among them. And the figure that's seated on the throne looks like a man. It is in appearance of a man, and what appeared to be his waist. From what appeared to be his waist up, he glows like metal, and below that, like fire. And then the whole thing is summarized. We're told what this all is depicting and representing, and it says, "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." And so it's all very tentative language, as though Ezekiel is seeing something he doesn't have any words for, and he's just having to use the words he's got. And so he says it's like this, but that's not exactly it. And it looked like this. but I don't have words to describe it more accurately. It's like in appearance, it was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And so it's all very tentative language. He's describing something he doesn't seem to have the words to describe. And so he's just doing the best he can with it. And we're told that this is, again, it's the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And so then the immediate question is, why is it here? Because the glory of God and this depiction of the glory of God is in Judah, in Jerusalem, in the temple. The glory of God rests in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, above the Ark of the Covenant. And in fact, this whole depiction, this whole thing might be kind of intended to reflect or to look like what is inside the Holy of Holies. It's this larger-than-life, moving, living version of the inside of the Holy of Holies, with the Ark of the Covenant. That is, on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, there are the 4 seraphim, these angelic figures, these seraphim whose wings stretch out and touch each other, and above the seraphim is the mercy seat where the glory of God dwells. And so he's seeing all of this here, and then the question is, why is this in Babylon? Why is the glory of God here in Babylon and not in Jerusalem at the temple? That question doesn't get answered in chapter 1, but we will see later an answer to that question. Why is it here? Why is it here in Babylon? And then this voice that takes us through this description takes up basically all of chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, this voice tells Ezekiel, the one that's seated on the throne, tells Ezekiel to stand up. And so God tells Ezekiel to stand up, and that God is about to tell him what he is going to do. That he is going to serve God as a prophet, and God is about to tell him, give him his instructions. And one of the things that God does is he pulls out, or that Ezekiel is given this scroll. One of these angelic beings hands him this scroll, and he notices that the scroll is written on both sides. It's written all over, inside and outside. Both sides of the scroll are written on. And he notices that the language, the words, are just gloom and doom. It's words of lament and mourning and woe. And so he sees all of this, basically all the bad news that he's got to deliver to Judah and to the people in and around Jerusalem. All the bad news that he's about to have to give them and deliver to them. And then he's told to take that scroll and eat it. And so he does. He takes the scroll and he eats it. And he says that the scroll tastes as sweet as honey in his mouth, which is kind of a jarring difference from what you would expect, with the language of the scroll being all gloom and doom and misery and mourning and woe and all the judgment that God is going to bring on the people. There's all of this bad news, but it's sweet as honey in his mouth. And it's kind of a jarring difference in what you expect, counterintuitive. And so then he's told, once he has consumed the scroll, he says, now you will go and speak my words to the people. And so the image is he eats this scroll filled with the words that God is giving him, and then he is now going to go, now that these words are in his mouth and in himself, he's going to go and speak them. And so he's told to go and do this, but he's also warned that, even though they are his own people, that they're probably not going to listen, but he's got to go and tell them anyway. And then he's told that he is to serve as a watchman. And a watchman is somebody that serves in the watch. It's usually a soldier or somebody that is known for being alert and having good eyesight, and they stand on the walls and they look out from the city to see if there's any kind of danger or enemy approaching. And if they see an enemy army coming, their job is to shout out the warning, to sound the alarm, to make sure that the people in the city know that the danger that's coming from outside is almost on top of them. And so that's the watchman's job there, to sound out the alarm when they see something that threatens the city. And Ezekiel is told that he is going to be a watchman, but instead of looking for an enemy army coming and threats from the outside, he is going to warn the people of the danger of their own actions, their own sinfulness and idolatry, their rebellion against God. And so he is to be this watchman that will sound the alarm at the danger that's coming, the things that are about to happen to them, that they are about to be harmed, but the danger is not going to come from the outside, but from within. But Ezekiel is told that just like a watchman, the watchman's job is to sound the alarm and to warn the city that danger is coming. And if the watchman does not sound the alarm, if the watchman doesn't give the warning, then the watchman will be held accountable for the death and destruction of the city, the harm that comes. And so in the same way, if Ezekiel does not warn them, if Ezekiel doesn't tell people what's going to happen, if he doesn't give them the warning, God is going to hold him responsible for the death and destruction that will come. And so even, there are people in the city that are going to do terrible things. They're going to do wicked and evil things, and he has to go and warn them. And if whether he warns them or not, they will die because of their sin. They're going to die because of the things that they have done wrong, the evil and wickedness. They'll die for that. But if he warns them, if he doesn't warn them, then God will hold him accountable for their death. And if he warns them and they don't listen to him, then that's on them. The watchman has done his job. The watchman does what he's supposed to do. He gave the warning. He sounded the alarm. Even if nobody listens, the watchman has discharged his duty and done what he's supposed to. And so this is all kind of the description of his duty and his job that God gives him. He's going to speak these words that God has given him, many of them warning and mourning and woe. And then he's to function as a kind of watchman, and his job is to warn the people. And if he doesn't warn the people, if he doesn't tell them about the consequences that are coming, he will be held accountable. And even though they're probably not going to listen, if he discharges his duty as a watchman, he'll be fine. He won't be held accountable. So that's the first 3 chapters of Ezekiel in summary or in brief. And then the second thing that from the first 11 chapters are pretty significant. They develop out these kind of major themes and show some major things that Jeremiah does. And that's the first 3 chapters. We see the glory of God is in Babylon and is speaking to him, and we get a description of Ezekiel's call, that he is called to be a prophet with the scroll and the watchman analogy. And then starting in chapter 4, we get several things that Ezekiel is told to do in order to warn the people of what's coming. And it's a series of kind of street theater prophecy, these kind of random things that Ezekiel is told to do to demonstrate or to show the people that destruction is coming, that the consequences are coming. And the first thing he's told to do is to do this kind of toy siege. He's to take a block of clay and to draw on it a depiction of the city of Jerusalem. So he's going to take this block of clay and kind of draw a depiction of the city of Jerusalem, its buildings and so on it, so that this block of clay is now Jerusalem. And then he's to take that clay block that represents Jerusalem and put it in a metal pot. And the walls of the metal pot, you got a pot that you cook in. It's got walls. It's a circle. It's walls all the way around it. And he's to take that clay city and put it inside of the metal pot, and the metal pot will be the walls of the city. And then he's to build these little miniature siege works, the miniature siege equipment, miniature forms of the siege equipment that an army might use, like ladders or catapults or siege tower or whatever. Build these miniature siege works and have this pretend siege to mock out a siege of this clay city in this metal pot, and do it in the middle of the streets, in the middle of the city. Which I gotta think would make people walk by and look at him like he's crazy. I mean, what do you think if you're gonna see, you catch an adult man in the middle of the city basically building Legos and pretending to have a war on the street corner? And that's what Ezekiel is told to do. He had to feel absolutely ridiculous, and people had to think that he was absolutely ridiculous when he did this. But this is what he was told to do, to depict what was about to happen to Jerusalem, that the city was going to be sieged, an army was going to come against it. Build this pretend siege, toy siege set up, and pretend to siege this clay city to show the people what is about to come. And this, by the way, was probably the least painful and difficult thing that Ezekiel got to do as a prophet, the least difficult of these sign acts or street theater prophecy that he's going to do. The next thing is that he has to function as, or to depict himself, portray himself as the scapegoat. Now, if you don't remember, the scapegoat, that comes from Leviticus chapter 16. In Leviticus 16, there is a description of the rituals that were supposed to be observed on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And the part of the rituals is that they were to select 2 goats, and then one of them would be used as a blood sacrifice, and the blood from that animal was taken in and sprinkled on the inside of the Holy of Holies, on the mercy seat and on the Ark of the Covenant, to purify it. and then would be sprinkled all over various things in the rest of the temple to purify it. This was an annual kind of purification, and it was a ritualistic atonement for the sins of the entire nation. Anything that hadn't been atoned for by other sacrifices was all done through this sacrifice, this Day of Atonement. And then, after he purified, the high priest purified everything else, he would go out to the other goat, which was called the scapegoat, and he would lay his hands on this other goat, and he would confess over it all the sins of Israel, all the things that the people of Israel had done wrong in their history and in that year. Confess the sins of the people over the scapegoat. And then someone else that was selected for the purpose would take that goat and carry it outside the city and then drive it away out into the wilderness. And symbolically, this was depicting the carrying away or the driving away of the sins of Israel. That because of what God has done through the temple, their sins are taken away from them and driven out. And they aren't held responsible for them anymore. And also that by driving these sins out, the people were showing that they would not continue to commit them. They were driving them away, so they wouldn't continue to dwell in them or wallow in them. And so Ezekiel is told to be the scapegoat, but he's told to be the scapegoat by lying on his side in the middle of the city. And he's to take rope and tie himself up in it and lay on his side in the middle of the city, in the streets. And he's to show that, the people, far from putting their sins and driving their sins away out of the camp and out of the city, instead of driving them away, they're tying them up and leaving them right here. And so he's to put the sins of Israel on him and then lie in the middle of the city instead of being driven away as he's supposed to be. And not only that, there's that, but then also the time for this, he's told to do this for 1 day for each of the years of the sin of Israel. And that turns out to be 390 years. And so for 390 days, he's to lie in the middle of the city tied up on one side. Presumably he doesn't do this like consecutively and never move. He does it for, most of the day and then gets up and leaves and then comes back the next morning and does the same thing. But for 390 days, he lies tied up on one side, and then at the end of the 390 days, the big climax moment of the street theater comes, and he rolls over to his other side and lies there for 40 days. And so he's supposed to depict for 390 days the sins of Israel, one for each year, and then he's to roll over and depict the sins of Judah for 40 days. And if that, a year and 3 months or so of lying on your side is not enough to, give you a bad day or to give Ezekiel a rough time, God also tells him that during this time, he is to take a very small amount, a certain amount of food and water every day and eat it at set times and drink it at set times. And so he's laying there tied up in these ropes, and then every once in a while he kind of sits up and takes a bite of some food and drink of water and then lies back down. But he only does it at set times. And the amount of food that he's supposed to take ends up being about 8 ounces. He makes about 8 ounces of flour and carries that 8 ounces of flour with him every day. And then the amount of water that he takes with him is about 3/4 of a quart or 2/3 of a quart. It's basically like, the 16.9 ounce bottles of water that you get and you drink. Half-liter bottles, it's slightly more water than that. Not much more water than just like one normal kind of purified water bottle that you carry around, the disposable water bottles. And so that's it. That's what he carries to drink with him. That's what he gets every day to drink. And he's not only is he supposed to only carry this small amount of water and this even smaller amount of food, but he's told to cook it over a fire to make bread out of this flour. Cooked, and he's to do it over a fire that is made from cow dung. He's to burn cow dung and use that as fuel to cook his food on. And the whole point of all of this is, one, he is the scapegoat. The sins of Israel are lying on him, and that he's there in the middle of the city. They have not driven their sins away. They have not taken their sins outside the camp, driven them away. They haven't repented and tried to do what was right. The people are just quite content and happy in the middle of their sin. And so God is going to cause the people to come under siege, and during that siege, they are going to have very little water and very little food, and they will eat anything that they can get their hands on, even if it's been cooked over cow dung, even if it is stinky, nasty, gross. And so he's told to eat this very small amount of food, drink this small amount of water, and cook his food over cow dung for this whole period to show how bad things are going to be when the city is sieged as a result of their sin. And so he's supposed to be the scapegoat and do all of this other stuff. That's kind of rough. That's a difficult way to spend over a year. And then he's told to give himself a haircut. He's told to take a very sharp sword and go and use it as a barber's razor and to shave the hair off of his face and off of the top of his head, which would have been humiliating because typically men at this time didn't shave their beards or their heads clean unless it was for a particular purpose. Like the men would shave their heads if it was part of a vow that they had made before the Lord. They would go to the temple. There would be this ritualistic cutting of their hair and shaving their head as a sign of kind of a new phase of life or a new thing starting. And that was about the only time that a Jewish man would shave his head or cut his hair short. And so Ezekiel is told to shave his head and shave his beard off. And this would have been kind of a humiliating thing. It would have been a thing that you would normally do if an army wanted to humiliate their opponents. They would capture their leaders and shave them and make them walk around bald and basically kind of looking like a full-grown baby. I think it was kind of the mental image. And so this was kind of a humiliating thing. This was a humiliation for Ezekiel. But he was supposed to display or show that the people were going to be humiliated. And then not only that, but he was to take the hair from shaving his face and his head, and divide it into 3 piles. And the 3 piles, the first one he was to burn. The second, he was to take around to various places in the city and take that same sword and chop it up even more. Dice up the hair till it's really short and fine. And then the third pile of hair, he was to take up and toss it into the air and let it be carried away by the wind. And so he would take it up to the top of the wall of the city and toss it and let the wind blow it away. And this was all supposed to be signs or depictions of what was about to happen to the people of Judah. That some inside the city was going to be destroyed and burned, and those inside the city would be burned along with it. And that others would be chopped up with a sword. They would be attacked by enemies, by an enemy army, and they would fall by the sword and be chopped up, and many of the people killed. And then still another chunk of the people would be scattered to the wind. They would be taken from the city and from the area and carried off into exile. And so many would die, but many more would be carried off into exile and driven away in the wind. But then there is he's told to take a small number of hairs, take just kind of a handful, and tuck it inside of his garment as a sign or a depiction that God is not going to allow all the people to be destroyed or scattered or carried away, but that God will preserve some to bring back, to preserve a remnant of Israel. And that, by the way, is another kind of frequent theme in not only Ezekiel, but in other Old Testament prophets. The idea that God reserves a remnant, that God is going to reserve a portion of the people and bring them home again in the future. And so this is all of this kind of street theater prophecy that he is told to do, and yet then he's also reminded and told that the people probably aren't going to listen. That he's got to do all of this. He's going to suffer through all of this, the humiliation of being shaved, the lying on his side for over a year, eating food cooked over cow dung, having to stand in the middle of the city and make a toy siege and look like a man-child, playing in the middle of the city. All of this stuff he's going to do, and still people aren't going to listen. People aren't going to get it. And finally, after he's done all these things, it's over a year later. He is given another vision in chapters 8 through 11. He's shown a depiction, or he sees a vision of that man from the first vision. The figure of a man that sits on the top of the vault above these angelic figures, or the 4 living creatures. That has, the lower half of fire and the upper half like glowing metal. Well, he sees this man appear before him, and this man reaches out and grabs him by the hair of his head and then lifts him up and then runs off with him to Jerusalem, carries him into Jerusalem from Babylon. And so he's taken on this very quick, abrupt trip into Jerusalem. And he's told, basically, I'm going to show you what's happening in the temple. I'm going to show you what is happening inside the temple. And so God, the glory of God, takes him and brings him to Jerusalem, and he is shown through the temple. And one of the first things he sees is this giant idol statue that's been set up in the middle of the temple, that the people are worshiping this idol statue in the middle of the temple courts. And then he said, he hears his voice and says, "Do you see what they're doing? I'm going to show you something even more detestable than this. I'll show you something even worse. Son of man, do you see this? I will show you something even more detestable." And then he's shown this kind of crack in the wall and told to dig it out. And so he digs out digs at this crack in the wall, and behind it he finds a doorway, and he opens the door and goes through, and he finds a group of the elders of Israel, the 70, the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders of Israel, with one priest leading them. And he looks around and he sees on the walls that there are all of these depictions of all of these detestable, disgusting things that are detestable and unclean to the Israelites. And the thing is that the inside of these walls inside the temple are supposed to be, where there are any decorations, they're supposed to be depictions of growing things like pomegranates and olive branches and olive leaves and trees growing. All of the images on the inside of the temple are supposed to be depictions of natural growing things to remind people of the Garden of Eden, to remind them of the place that God had created and preserved or prepared for human beings, and it was the place where the presence of God would come and walk with humans every day, and where humans and God coexisted peacefully. And so the inside of the temple is supposed to be that kind of place, a new place, a new place where the presence of God and people can come together, where there doesn't have to be the separation between God and his creation. And so instead of that, when he goes inside this section of the temple, he goes through this doorway, he finds that those depictions of the natural scenes have been painted over with all of this disgusting imagery from all of these idol practices, all this idol worship from the surrounding nations. And there's the 70 elders of Israel, the leading council, the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of Israel, is there with one of the priests, and they are worshiping these disgusting images and burning incense to them. And he hears the voice say, "Son of man, do you see what they're doing? I'll show you something even worse." And so he's taken then outside into an outer part of the temple, and he's shown a group of women that are mourning the death of a particular idol, mourning the death of a particular god called Tammuz. And this was part of an idol worship practice that was, something that some of the neighbors of Israel were about. And there's a group of women inside the temple worshiping this idol Tammuz. And then he's told, once again, "Do you see, Son of Man? I'll show you something even worse." And so then he's taken to the inner court of the temple. This is the area just outside of the main temple building, where the altar is, where the altar is for the sacrifices. People would bring in their sacrifices. The priest would slaughter them and offer the sacrifices on their behalf in this courtyard. And there is a group of these old men, these elders, these honorable men of Israel, and they're in this courtyard, but they have their backs turned to the temple, and their faces are towards the east. And with their backs to the presence of God, they worship the sun. And so they're offering worship to the rising sun instead of to the God whose temple they're actually in right behind them. And so God shows Ezekiel all of this, and then we see the four living creatures, the cherubim. And we get this insight now that these four living creatures that we see in chapter 1 are actually the cherubim that are depicted inside of the Holy of Holies, these angelic figures whose wings are over the Ark of the Covenant, and who above those wings the presence of God is supposed to dwell. And so these cherubim rise up out of the Holy of Holies. They come up out of this inner chamber of the temple, and the presence of God goes and dwells above them, and they all move to the very edge of the temple and look out over the city. And we see God tells Ezekiel to look out and see what's happening in the city and all the violence and the bloodshed there. These people, they have caused, these elders and leaders of Israel and all these kings and the priests and all that's happening inside the temple, they have caused my people to not only turn away from me and worship idols, but to be full of violence. This whole city is full of violence now because of them. And so we get that theme that we've seen in other prophets, that the idolatry leads to injustice because they have abandoned the law. And so that all of this evil and violence in the city because of all of the idolatry that's happening inside of God's temple. And then the presence of God rises up from this entrance to the temple and moves out to the east, out of the city and eventually above a mountain to the east. And then Ezekiel is taken and taken back to Babylon and dropped out of his vision. And so he sees all of this, and the answer, the question, the first question up at the top that I was told you to ask is, why is the presence of God in Babylon instead of in Jerusalem? And the answer that we get in chapters 8 through 11 is that all of the idolatry and the unfaithfulness in the city, in Jerusalem, inside the temple itself, has caused God to be so disgusted with the people of Judah that he has abandoned his own temple and now has come to Babylon where his people are in exile. And so two things that you're supposed to see there. One is that God is so disgusted by the people of Judah and their idolatry that he has abandoned his own temple and abandoned that land. But also, so on the one hand, that's one side, but then on the other side, God has not abandoned his people as he abandons the temple. Instead, he goes into exile with them, and he dwells with them there for all the years that they're in exile. And this section, chapter 11, ends with a promise. That God will not just abandon them and leave them there forever, but will in fact, he's going to go into captivity with them. He goes into exile with them. His glory dwells there with them, and then he will bring them back and restore the people. And not only will he restore them to this land, but he's going to change the people. Something has to be done. It's not just that the land is wrong, or that the city is wrong, or that the temple is wrong. It's that there's something wrong with the people. That they keep turning away from God and towards these idols. And so God is going to change them. He is going to, in the words of Ezekiel 11, 19, it says, I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give to them a heart of flesh. And so God says the ultimate problem is not the sacrificial system or even the idols surrounding them, the nations surrounding them. The problem is my people's hard hearts. And if I'm going to rescue and redeem those people, if I'm going to bring them back and restore them, then I can't just bring them back and give them back all the stuff that they have lost. I have to fix them. I have to restore them. And so I'm going to take away their hard hearts and give them soft hearts, tender hearts, hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone. And this is the first 11 chapters of Ezekiel, and this is where that ends. We're 40 minutes into the 50-minute period, so, why did we spend this much time on this? Because this is an incredibly important image for Ezekiel. This question, what is God doing? And why is God allowing Jerusalem to be destroyed? Why is God allowing the temple to be taken out? This is where God's presence dwells, isn't it? This is where the glory of God is. And the land of Israel is the promised land that God promised to their ancestors. And so those were kind of like fixed points in their minds, the fixed things. These can't be changed. This is the land God has given to us, and here is where God causes his presence to dwell. The temple in Jerusalem is the place where God's presence and glory dwells. And so Ezekiel is seeing all of this stuff, all of this image, and he's being told to do all these things, promising the end of Jerusalem and the end of Judah, the destruction of the temple, all of these things. And he's being shown this very stunning, weird imagery to convince him and so that he can convince the others that those things that they considered fixed were not fixed. God's presence is not married to the temple in Jerusalem. God has caused his presence to dwell there in order to be among his people. But his people have so abandoned him and have so turned against his intentions for them that he is abandoning the temple and the land and is going to allow it to be taken over and given to others. But even though God is going to abandon the temple and the land, he is not abandoning his people. That he has not betrayed his promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all those that came after them. Instead, he will go into exile with them and will bring them home again when the time is right. And that eventually, ultimately, he will give them new hearts and allow so that the people can actually be his and worship him. And so that's the first 11 chapters. And then the rest of the book, we have three panels or sections, three divisions of God's judgment. Three depictions or sections that describe in various ways God's judgment on three different groups or places. The first is on Judah, chapters 12 through 24. We see God's judgment on Judah. And then in chapters 25 through 32, we have God's judgment on the nations. And then in chapter 33, we see the judgment on Jerusalem itself. And in fact, it's not just that we're told what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Ezekiel receives a guest or a messenger, a survivor of the siege in Jerusalem, who comes to tell him that the temple and the city have in fact been destroyed by Babylon, and the remainder of the people carried away. And so he gets the news of the final destruction of Jerusalem. In chapters 12 to 24, in the sections that are dealing with the judgment that is coming on the people of Judah themselves, the God's people in and around Jerusalem, the first thing that we are given is one more act of street theater prophecy from Ezekiel. He is told to go and pack his stuff and then come out with all of his stuff packed up like he's going into exile in the morning, and then he's to spend the day digging through the wall, and then in the evening he's to carry his stuff out through the wall like he is going off into exile. So it's this one last kind of depiction of what God intends to do to Jerusalem, so that the people will have their kind of final warning. They'll know what's coming. And then there is a series of different kind of parables or images that are given for what's going on with Israel and Judah and what their relationship with God is like. He refers to Israel as being like a useless vine. Have you ever gone into the woods and seen wild grapevines? They don't actually produce anything you can eat, and they're not really very good for making anything out of. There's some people that make kind of decorative banisters and things if you want a real kind of outdoorsy look in your house. But other than that, there's not really anything you can use these wild grapevines for. And it's something similar. It's a kind of a wood or a plant that's not really useful for anything. You can't really do anything with it. And even if you try to burn it, it doesn't really produce a good fire. But then, it's just a useless thing. And God says that's what Judah is. It has become totally useless because of its abandonment of me, because it's unfaithful to me. And so he's going to allow it to be burned on both ends and charred in the middle. But even then, it's still not very useful. So Israel or Judah has become this useless thing. And then there's another depiction of Israel as an unfaithful or adulterous wife that God had raised up out of poverty, and having been abandoned and rejected by everyone else, God extends his love to Israel and raises it up and gives it all these good things, and yet it is still unfaithful to God. And so we get that theme common that we've seen in the prophets, that the idolatry of God's people is spiritual adultery. It's marital unfaithfulness. And then there is a kind of an odd image involving two eagles and the top part of a cedar tree that's been carried off by the eagles. And so several different of these kind of parable images in this section. And then there's also a section, or several sections, where Ezekiel serves as kind of a prosecuting attorney, a lawyer accusing Israel of all of their failures and their wrongdoing. And this section ends, the very last thing in chapter 24 is Ezekiel's wife dies. And God tells him that he is not to publicly mourn her death, because his mourning of her, or his not mourning her, will serve as another sign to the people. And so he goes out one morning and he prophesies, and when he gets home in the evening, his wife dies. And then he gets back up the next morning and he goes out and he continues prophesying that nothing happened. And the point of that, this thing that God has Ezekiel do, is that that death and mourning and grief are going to become so common that people can't stop to mourn. And there will be so much death and so many things to mourn that they won't be able to take days off to mourn. They'll just have to keep going. Things are about to get that bad. And then in chapters 25 through 32, we get a series of descriptions of God's judgment that's going to come on all these various nations. All the various nations that Israel has trusted during this time, made treaties with, thinking that would protect them. And so there are the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the people of Tyre and Sidon, the people of, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and that all of these people, all these things that they've done, and they're all warned through Ezekiel, Babylon is coming. all of you will fall to Babylon. All of you that Israel has turned to and trusted, and all of your evil and things that you've done, all of it will fall, and Babylon is coming, and Nebuchadnezzar will carry you all the way. And then there is, in chapter 33, as I said, the messenger comes, the survivor of the siege in Jerusalem comes and tells Ezekiel that it's happened. Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem is over because Jerusalem has fallen. The walls have been broken down, the city has been burned, and the temple is destroyed. There's nothing left. And so all these things, all these warnings of judgment that Ezekiel had been giving for this first chunk of his life have come true. It's all happened. And so then we get three more segments. This isn't the end of Ezekiel. At the end of this, after chapter 33, we get three more segments that give hope, messages of hope to each of these three segments we've seen promises of judgment for. And so first for Judah, and then for the nations, and then finally for Jerusalem, and through Jerusalem, all of the rest of creation. And so in chapters 34 through 37, we are given this picture, these messages of hope for God's people, for the people of Judah. And the major component of that is this messianic hope that God will raise up someone from the line of David to lead them and to bring them back, to restore his people. And so that the Messiah will come, this messianic hope that we've seen in several places. And then there's a reminder of this promise of a heart of flesh, that God will give his people a new heart, and they will be his people, and he will be their God. And then in chapter 37, there is this vision of a valley of dry bones. Ezekiel is taken out, told to go out into this valley, and he's carried there by the Spirit, and he sees this valley is full of old, dried out, just skeletons. It's just bones laying everywhere. And he's asked, "Tell me, son of man," God says, "tell me, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel says, "You know, Lord." And he's like, I don't know, you know. And so God tells him, prophesy to these bones and tell them to live. And so Ezekiel, probably kind of feeling strange, turns and looks at the bones and prophesies to them and tells them to live. And they start kind of coming together, snapping together. And there's this great sound of rattling, crackling bones, and they all snap together and they stand up. And then God causes them to be covered up in organs and meat and muscle and guts and then eventually with skin, so that they are, complete human bodies standing there. And then God tells Ezekiel, prophesy to the wind, tell the wind to come. And he prophesies to the wind and tells the wind to come, and the wind comes and blows, and breeze blows into each of these bodies, and they begin breathing and living. And this is a kind of a thing with both Hebrew and Greek, the main languages of the Old Testament and New Testament. It's different words, but same concept. In both, the words for spirit and breath and wind are all the same word. And so when he says prophesy to the wind, he's saying wind, spirit, breath. Prophesy to the wind, spirit, breath, and tell the wind to enter them and let them breathe. And they do, and they come alive. And God tells Ezekiel, this is what I'm going to do for the people of Israel. They are dead because of their abandonment of me, because of their unfaithfulness to me. And their nation has crumbled and is effectively dead now. But I will give it new life again. I can make these bones live. I can make Israel and Judah, I can make them live again too. And so that's the hope for Judah, and then God's judgment on the nations. God gives them hope in chapters 38 and 39 through a promise of ultimate victory, that God will emerge victorious over the nations. And when God defeats all of the evil and injustice and violence and all of the worst stuff from all of these nations, then the nations themselves will be rescued. They will be better under the rule of God than they have ever been under the rule of all of these other violent and unjust kings. And so God's judgment, God's victory over these nations will be their great hope. And then for Jerusalem, chapters 40 through 48, we see this hope not only for Jerusalem, but for all creation. God promises to give this new temple with all kinds of specifications for its size and whatnot. And this new temple will come, and out of this new temple will flow the stream of living water that will flow even into the Dead Sea and give it life. And this will be like a depiction of this new Eden with new life coming from there. And then there will be a new city that God promises, and the name of this new city is The Lord is There. And that is the last words in the book of Ezekiel. The Lord is there. This new hope that is not only for Jerusalem, but for all of creation. And that's it for Ezekiel, and we're